Hi everyone, this is Dr. McClellan. This is your lecture for Athenaze Chapter 11. For those of you in the fall 2018 class, you guys are now hopefully doing some work on your midterms, so this will be a little bit new. Save this until after you've finished with the exam. Take care of that first, and then we'll go through this a little bit more in detail tomorrow on Monday. So Chapter 11 is a big one because it's going to give us a few more forms that will be important for really the rest of your time reading Greek. We're going to learn about a new tense, the aorist tense, which has a couple ways of forming in Greek. It's a very complicated tense, and at first it can be a little bit difficult to get your head around because it's very different from other tenses that you may find if you take Latin, for example. There is no aorist in Latin. There's no aorist in English, for that matter. It's something unique to ancient Greek. But with a little bit of practice and with a little bit of focus on just knowing the forms, it's usually fairly easy to get your head around. So today we're going to look at what is typically called either the second or thematic aorist. I'll explain what those terms mean a little bit. But before we get to that, we'll talk a little bit about the Greek verbs in general. So as of the last chapter, you now have two tenses, the present and the future, which, as you saw, formed for the most part fairly regularly, but there are times when you have to pay attention to the principal parts of the Greek verbs to know how they're going to form. So just to make sure we have a clear sense of where we're going, remember that every Greek verb has 5 pieces of information that you can identify that will help you translate it. Person and number are the charts that you see at the top, first, second, and third, singular and plural, I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, and they. That's person and number. Tense tells me when an action occurs, although it will also tell me how complete an action is, as I'll explain in a little bit. Mood describes the degree to which an action is real. So far we've been just dealing with the indicative mood, indicating that something is in fact happening or will happen later. And finally, voice. You've already seen 2 of these, the active and middle voice. We don't need to go over that too much today. You will see forms for both of them. But remember this list over the next few chapters. When verbs start to look a little bit confusing, and they are one of the more challenging parts of ancient Greek, just remember that any verb that you look at has 5 pieces of information, and if you can narrow those down and check them off one by one, you can translate it. So, looking a little bit ahead, Greek has only a few set tenses, and you've already learned the first 2 on this list. There are 7 in all that differ in time, referring to when the action occurs, and aspect, which refers to how complete the action is. And so, even though this is going to be skipping ahead a little bit, you will actually not learn some of these until the end of next semester. It's worth taking a look at all of the different tenses that you will see. So far you've learned the first 2, the present tense, which either has a simple aspect, I walk or I am hit, just generally, simply, or continuous aspect, I am walking, it's a continuing action, I am being hit, continuous as well. The future also has both simple and continuous translations. You can either translate a future tense Greek verb with I will walk or I will be hit, if it's passive, or I will be walking, or I will be getting hit, a continuous aspect. Both of those are perfectly good translations for the future tense in Greek. A little bit later we'll learn the imperfect tense, which is how I describe something that's happening in the past, but only when it's an incomplete or continuous action. So an imperfect in Greek would be translated with I was walking or I was being hit. Today, however, we're going to look at the aorist tense, the one in the middle of this list, which describes, in general terms, a simple past action. I walked or I was hit, quite simply. We'll eventually, next semester, learn the different forms of the perfect tenses, which refer to complete actions like I have walked, i.e. I've finished walking, or I have been hit, that action's been complete, or a future perfect, I will have walked, i.e. I will finish walking at a certain point, or I will have been hit, and the pluperfect, which refers to past completed actions, I had walked, I was walking in the past and finished the action, and when I'd finished, something else happened. I had walked when blank, or I had been hit, complete action in the past. We can make this a little bit easier by putting these on a chart, this one here. These are all the tenses that you will learn over this semester and next semester. And you can basically break down Greek tenses along an x-axis, left to right, for going from past time to present time to future time, but also charting them along aspect, simple, continuous, incomplete action, and perfect, completed action. Ignore the bottom row, the pluperfect, which is past perfect or past complete action, the perfect, which is present complete action, and the future perfect, which, as you can tell, is future complete action, will be dealt with next semester. Those are a separate system. We won't have to worry about those right now, but if you're interested in just seeing the forms, you can see the examples of the verb I've provided here below. Just take a look at the first two rows, the top two rows. So far, we've learned the ones for the present time and future time. The present tense and future tense cover both simple and continuous aspects. So paideuo, for example, can be translated both as I teach, just generally, that's simple aspect, and I am currently teaching. I am teaching. That's incomplete action. I haven't finished teaching yet. I'm in the middle of teaching, so I'll still use the present tense paideuo to express that aspect. The future is the same way. In Greek, paideuso, you already know how to form futures from the last chapter, covers simple aspect, I will teach, generally, simply, or I will be teaching, continuous or incomplete action. This gets important when we look at past time, past tense verbs. Greek uses two different tenses, two different forms of their verbs to distinguish between past actions in simple aspect, which will be the aorist, which we're covering today. That's what you see in the blue box on the screen here. And later on, we'll learn that to cover continuous or incomplete action, I'll use the imperfect tense, a totally separate form, which is going to follow a different formula for its formation. So in the chart here, if I want to say I taught, very simply in the past, I'll use the aorist form of paideuo, which in this case is paideusa, I taught, versus paideuon, which was the imperfect form, I was teaching. Totally different meanings, totally different translations between them. So today we're just going to focus on the box on the top left, the aorist, past simple action. So generally speaking, the aorist tense is pretty simple to translate when you see it in a finite form, because it's pretty much like the past tense in English. I walked or I was hit. Those would be aorists in Greek. Another way to think of the aorist and imperfect is to use an analogy of a photograph or a video. The aorist is kind of like looking at a photograph of an action. So-and-so fed the crocodile. I have a snapshot. It was a simple action that took place once. But the imperfect is almost like you're watching a film, an action as it's going on. So-and-so was feeding the crocodile and kept feeding the crocodile when suddenly something else happened in the aorist. It snapped, maybe. And that's the important distinction between the aorist and imperfect. The imperfect is always continuing action. Something was taking place but didn't finish taking place, versus the aorist, which covers something that happens once in the past, simple action. So hopefully that makes the distinction fairly clear. If you have to spend a little time going back to the previous slide or rewinding a little bit on this video until the aorist and imperfect and the distinction between them makes sense, this is a good time to do so in this video before we continue. Once you're ready, come back to this slide and we'll talk a little bit more about how to form the aorist. So hopefully you're ready to go forward at this point. The aorist is a tricky tense in Greek because it can be formed in two different ways. There are two ways of forming the aorist in ancient Greek. One way, what we call the first aorist, or some more technically call it the sigmatic aorist, because a sigma is featured as part of the way of forming it, is a pretty simple aorist. It just involves adding a sigma to the stem and using different endings. This is something we'll see in chapters 12 and 13, so it won't be long until you see those forms of the aorist. That's roughly equivalent to what we do in English when we put a verb in the past tense by adding ed to the end of a verb. That's pretty much what the first aorist is like in ancient Greek. So for a verb like I walk, when I put that in the past tense in English, I just add ed, I walked, to say that I did that in the past. That's roughly what the first aorist is like. The second aorist, however, the one we're going to focus on today, is much more complicated, or at least it looks like it at first. The second aorist, or what we sometimes call the thematic aorist, involves changing the verb stem entirely when it goes into the aorist tense. It's a little bit less common. The first aorist is a little bit more typical in Greek, but you will see enough second aorists that you do want to be very familiar with how this goes. In English, this is pretty equivalent to a verb like I go. If I want to say I did that in the past, I'm not going somewhere right now, but I did so yesterday, I wouldn't say I goed. I wouldn't add ed to the end of that verb. That would sound silly to us. We all know from learning English that we would say I went to the store in the past. Well, think of that as kind of the equivalent of the second aorist. I've changed the verb stem from go to went. Those are actually two different verb stems that came to us from Older English that got combined into one system, and some aorist verbs will behave pretty similarly. So this is pretty much what the second aorist is like. The verb stem changes from what it looks like in the present to look like a past tense form. So here are two examples of these two types of aorists. And remember, we're only going to focus very closely on the second aorist, which you can see is in blue at the bottom of the slide. But just so we're kind of clear on where we are in the forest of Greek verbs, I do want to talk about both these types. So one thing that you will always want to remember when you're looking for an aorist verb, or when you recognize an aorist verb, is that it always will have what we call a temporal augment, which is basically epsilon with smooth breathing added to the very beginning of the verb stem or the word. So for example, if I want to make luo, I loosen, an aorist verb, I want to say I loosened, I would add, and you can see in the bullet point below, elusa. Elusa tells me that epsilon, that it's past time. That's what we mean by temporal augment. It means that it's telling me it's further in the past than the present. And the rest of that tells me it's aorist. This is, like I said, this is an example of what the first aorist looks like, where I usually add an augment epsilon before the stem lu and sigma and alpha. We're going to learn this form in chapter 12. Don't worry so much about it now, but you can tell that it's aorist right away because of that epsilon at the beginning of the verb. Elusa tells me it's I loosened in the past. In the second aorist, the same thing will happen. One verb that uses a second aorist is lepo, I leave. When it goes to the second aorist, it becomes elipon, I left. Now, right away, you can tell between those two forms that the big difference is the stem of the verb itself. Instead of using the present form leip, which I would get if I took the omega away in the present stem, it's shortened a little bit to lip. That's actually the real root of the verb. The earliest forms of leave in our ancient Greek texts come from this stem. The aorist is usually the simpler form, but it's always different from the present. So here, the way I'd recognize it as an aorist is both by the augment at the beginning, there's epsilon again, elip, but also because lepo has switched over to lip. So elipon is I left in ancient Greek. That's how the second aorist is formed. So remember the formula that you see at the top of this slide. Epsilon, your temporal augment, tells you it's going into the past. The aorist stem change is what happens in the second or thematic aorist, and then you're going to want to know the secondary endings that go with it. Those are also going to be new forms that you have to memorize in this chapter. Like I said, the aorist is quite a lot to get at first. A couple rules to remember about when the augment is added to verbs. The examples that you see on this page largely come from the first aorist because they're a little bit easier to memorize, so I'll come back to this slide a little bit later, next week or so. But just worry about what's happening with the augment on this page. So when the augment goes in front of a verb that begins with a vowel, that vowel will typically lengthen. So for example, if my verb like akuo begins with alpha, or if I have one that begins with epsilon, like egeiro, I wake someone up, those two vowels, alpha and epsilon, when they have an augment put in front of them, will lengthen to eta. So if you take a look at the first bullet point below, akuo when it becomes an aorist, becomes ekusa, I heard. That's the epsilon and alpha lengthening together. Same with egero. Instead of saying I wake up right now, if I want to put that in the aorist tense, I'll put the epsilon with the epsilon, and that will give me eta. Egera. It's lengthened, the beginning of that verb. So just remember that when the augment goes at the beginning of something with a vowel, it's going to lengthen that sound. If the verb starts with omicron, for example, it'll also lengthen to omega. Same rule. This gets a little bit tricky when the verb begins with a diphthong, two vowels making one sound. The augment is only going to affect the first vowel in that sequence. So for example, elchomai, I pray, will become euxamein. I've only lengthened the epsilon to an eta, and I've kept the upsilon, the second vowel, intact. So you can still recognize what verb that comes from, even if you take away the augment from the beginning. Euxamein, I prayed. The one exception, or the one sub-note to this rule, is that if the second vowel is an iota, like in the verb aiteo, that iota, after the lengthening occurs, will become a subscript. So aiteo, when it goes to the aorist, becomes eitesa. What happened there? Well, epsilon and alpha combined into an eta. The alpha lengthens to an eta with the augment. And because the iota is left over from that, and the iota is a relatively weak vowel, it becomes a subscript over time. It doesn't get pronounced as much as some of the other vowels in these combinations. So you get eitesa in the aorist. Don't worry about those endings and those examples for now. Those are all first aorists. We'll learn about those in the next chapter. Just be aware of what's happening with the augment. The last rule you need to remember about the augment is very important because this throws a lot of people off when they're practicing taking things from the present into the aorist in their charts. If you have a compound verb, or a verb, in other words, that has a prefix like pros, ek, para, for example, put on the beginning of a verb, apo is another example. Remember this rule. The augment doesn't come before the prefix, but before the verb stem. So for example, if I want to take the verb ekbalo, I throw something out, and I want to put that into the aorist, my augment doesn't go before ek. That's just kind of icing on the cake for that verb, but instead will go before the verb stem. What's the action in ekbalo? Well, it's really balo. It's throwing, and ek is just thrown on as an afterthought to throw out. So here, when I make this an aorist, I'm going to take my prefix x or ek, leave that alone. My epsilon will go between that and the verb stem bal, which is going to change. This is an example of a second aorist in action before I end with on and all the other endings that we'll look at in a little bit. So ex ebelon is the aorist of ekbalo. That's where the epsilon goes. So when you're looking for the augment, when you're identifying it, pay very close attention to what type of verb you have. If you have a compound, it's going to come between the prefix and the verb stem. Same thing with katabalo. If I throw something down, if I want to make that an aorist, I'll take away kata, down. That's just a prefix. That's icing on the cake. Put epsilon before the verb stem, e before bal, and then I'll finish that with my personal endings, starting with on, which is the verb form for I. What you're left with is kata e balon, or since I'm going to have two vowels run into each other here, there will be a little bit of elision to katebalon, I threw down. That is pretty much the form you get in the aorist. So, how does the second aorist work? The basic rule to remember is the formula you get at the top. The second aorist, or the thematic aorist, if you prefer to know it by its technical term, is formed with an augment, usually epsilon, a new aorist stem, a change in the stem, plus the secondary endings. Those are the three things that go into a second aorist. I want you to remember those steps. So similar, like I said, to go versus went in English. I've changed the stem from that verb from go, which is what I use in the present tense, to went in past time. Sometimes this will be pretty easy to detect. Lepo, like you saw before, just simply changes its stem to lip. So you get lipon, I left. And that's pretty easy to recognize. It looks a lot like lepo. And oftentimes, second aorists are just shorter or simpler forms of the present tense. But sometimes they'll look a little bit different. Gignomai, for example, is pretty easy to recognize. Again, amen is what the aorist form looks like. That's I became in the past. It's pretty closely related to giganomai. You can kind of hear the similarity. Gen is the real root. This is where we get our word Genesis, for example. That might help you remember it when you look at the aorist. But sometimes you will get a completely different stem entirely. Pharaoh, I carry, when it goes to the aorist, becomes a nenkon. How on earth did I get that form? Well, if you look at the very bottom of this slide, you can see how that form breaks down. There's an epsilon augment at the beginning that lengthens the first epsilon in the aorist stem, enenk, you can see in blue, before I add the personal endings, or the secondary endings, beginning with on. When I put all those together, enenk, and on, I get a nenkon, the aorist form for I carried. This is an example of something I mentioned last time when I looked at all of the different forms in the future, what we call suppletion, where two different verb stems entirely get combined into one system. The only way that you can know that pharaoh becomes a nenkon here is just to memorize the forms together. So oftentimes, some of the principal parts that you're going to see are going to be important to memorize together. So as you go back through your flashcards, it's very important now, and you can use the lists in Chapter 11 to go through these, to start listing all the principal parts for the verbs that go through irregular changes. So it's probably a good idea to have one flashcard with pharaoh oiso, its future tense, and a nenkon, and start memorizing those forms together, because you're going to want to know that a nenkon comes from pharaoh, and there's no way to do that except by memorizing it. So let's talk about the endings in the aorist. I've been alluding to them for a while, but I haven't gone through them yet. In order to understand what's going on here, let's take a step back. What we're looking at in this chapter are what we call the secondary set of endings. So far, you've seen primary endings, which are typically used for what we call the primary tenses, which include the present and future tenses. So in the active voice, you've already seen, for example, o, ace, a, amen, etta, usi, I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, they. That should hopefully be familiar by now. Same with the middle passive. You should also by now have pretty much down oh my, a, which is a contracted form of si. Remember, sigma drops out, epsilon and alpha become eta, and iota goes underneath. Oh my, a, etai, ametha, estha, ontai. Those are your middle passive primary endings, what you use with the present and future. So far, that hasn't changed. This chapter is going to introduce you to another set of endings that we call secondary, used for what we call secondary tenses, which include the aorist, the imperfect, and a few others that we're going to see later. So fortunately, once you know these endings, they're going to come back again. So it's not just a one-time thing, but these are very important to memorize in this chapter. So I'm going to go through these one at a time. The active secondary endings in order are on, s, sometimes with n, a nu drops out there, amen, ete, on. And the middle passive endings are amen, u, which is a contracted form of essa. What happened here is sigma drops out between two vowels, and you already know that epsilon and omicron contract into u, followed by eta, ametha, estha, anta. I'll just go over those again. Amen, I, u, you, eta, he, she, or it, ametha, we, estha, y'all, and anta, they. These are all going to be endings you need to memorize in this chapter because you're going to see them very frequently attached to aorist verbs. Okay, so what does this look like when we put it together? Let's take one example in the active voice to look at those active endings. So we've already seen that lepo, if you look at the principal parts like you see here, has a second aorist form, elipon. So this is illustrating a really important thing I want you to remember from this chapter as well. The only way that you can really tell when something is first or second aorist is by looking at its principal parts. There's no way to really predict which form one's going to go to. So because I know elipon is the aorist stem, I can take that third principal part that's underlined and go through all the forms. So I'll start with the obvious one, elipon, I left, which has an augment. You can see the epsilon in red. The aorist stem lip, which you can see is blue, and the secondary ending on for I. So when I put those three together, I get elipon, or I left. It's a pretty simple formula when you really get down to it. The second person singular, you left, starts with my augment, epsilon, my aorist stem lip, and the second person singular ending s for you. When I put them together, I get elipes, you left. Third person singular, same formula. Start with your augment that's in red, aorist stem lip, that's in blue, and in the magenta color or n, the nu can sometimes drop off, which is he, she, or it left, elipen. For plural forms, even easier to recognize. They're pretty similar to what you've seen before. Start with my augment, in red, my aorist stem lip, in blue, and my ending amen for we. Elipomen is we left. Very simple. Y'all left, start with my augment, epsilon, my aorist stem lip, in this case, and the secondary ending ete for y'all left, elipete. And then finally, this is the tricky part of the aorist in the second form, elipon, it's my augment epsilon, my aorist stem lip, and my ending on is also they left. So you'll notice that I left and they left in Greek look the exact same. They are exactly the same spelling. They use the same ending. Elipon can be translated either way. The only way you can tell the difference and decide between them is to look at the rest of the sentence. If you have one subject and it's clear that I am speaking, it would make more sense to say elipon is I left. But if you have a subject like, say, hoi neanii, the young men, in the nominative, then it makes a lot more sense to say they left in the sentence. So you can always use the rest of the sentence to help figure out what translation is best suited. So those are the active forms. Let's take a look at the middle endings, the secondary endings in action. Gignomai, when it goes to the future, as you saw before, becomes genesomai. It goes through a change, and that stem is roughly reflected in its aorist, which is egenomein. Because I know that third principal part, the one underlined, is using a secondary ending from the second aorist, I'm going to follow the same endings that we saw a couple slides ago, starting with egenomein, that's my augment epsilon, my new aorist stem gen, which is related to the word genesis, that's how you can remember this word in the aorist, and ending with amein, I. When I put those together, I get I became, egenomein. The second person singular, as I mentioned before, goes through a couple changes. Start with your augment your aorist stem in this case is gen, and the second person singular ending will eventually be u, egenu, you became. The reason it's u, why it looks so different, is that originally it was essa. Sigma drops out between the two vowels. Epsilon and omicron give you u. This is something you've seen roughly equivalent before, but you can also just memorize the ending as u if that's easier for you. So egenu, you became. Third person singular, start with your augment, which is epsilon in red. Your aorist stem, again, is gen. And third person singular, he, she, or it, is eta. Egeneta is he, she, or it became. Make sure it's past tense. Now let's go to the plurals on the right side. We became is going to start with the augment epsilon in red, aorist stem gen, and another ending, ometha, for we. Put together, egenometha is we became. Second person plural, start with my augment epsilon in red, my aorist stem gen in blue, and my magenta esthe for y'all, and I put them together to get egenesthe, y'all became. And then finally, for they, third person plural, start with my augment my aorist stem gen, and my secondary ending for they, which is onta. Again, onta means they became in the past. And these two slides, this one and the previous one, are how I form any second aorist once I know the first form from the third principal part. Now, that's how you form your finite endings, how I say I went or I became or I left or he left, etc. When we look at the infinitives, the participles, and the imperatives, which will also appear in the aorist tense, your only formula here is that you want to use the new aorist stem, this is only true of the second aorist, plus the usual endings you've already learned. In other words, the rule to remember is that the augments, those epsilons at the beginning of aorists, only appear in what we call the indicative mood, when I want to say I left, or he left, or she left, or so forth. When I use these for an imperative, I'm not going to use an augment at all. That's only used for the indicative mood. That's an important rule you want to remember, and it's guaranteed that everyone's going to forget this rule a few times. I will very likely forget that rule a few times. It's something that happens quite a lot. It trips a lot of us up when we're reading Greek, so don't let it stress you out or frustrate you if you forget this once in a while, but just keep this rule in mind. You want to remember that augments only show up in the indicative mood when I want to say I went or he went or so forth. So, very simply, when I want to make something an imperative in the aorist, I use the aorist stem, for example, lip or gen, the verbs you saw in the last two slides, and use the usual endings. So if I want to say leave in the aorist tense, I'll start with lip and add either lipe, or the plural lipete, which is roughly equivalent to leipe and leipete in the present. You can see the difference between them is just the stem. Lip is the aorist stem, and leip is the present stem. Same thing in the middle voice. If I want to use my imperative endings in the middle, I'll start with my aorist stem gen and either say genu, which is my first, or rather my second singular imperative form, if I say to one person, hey you, become blank, or geneste in the plural. Compare that to gignu and gigneste, the present forms with the present stem that you saw before. The infinitives are also very simple. You just start with your aorist stem lip or gen and add the infinitive endings. So lip pain is the active aorist infinitive as opposed to lay pain, which is the present form. So lip pain versus lay pain. And gennestai is my aorist infinitive for gignomai, as opposed to gignestai, which is the present infinitive. You can see the stem has changed between them. The same thing is going to happen with participles. The participles are no different in the second aorist. The only thing I'm changing is the stem from the present form to the aorist. So rather than lepon, lepusa, lepon, I'm going to have lippon, lippusa, and lippon, and the genitives are all going to form like you've seen them before, lippontos or lippuses, lippontos. Pretty simple. The middle is also going to be the same as what you've learned for middle participles. So gen is my stem for gignomai, if I want to use it in the aorist. Add omen to make it a participle sound, and os a on. Genomenos, genomene, genomenon are all the aorist participle of gignomai. Very simple. So nothing new here. The key on this slide is that you have to recognize when a verb switches its stem from a present stem like gigne or leipe to the aorist forms like lip and gen. It sometimes can be a very subtle difference, but it makes all the difference in the world when we translate them. So you might have been asking yourself, why on earth would somebody in Greek want to use an aorist infinitive or an aorist participle or even an aorist imperative? Why would I want to make a command in past time? Well, in these forms, outside of the indicative mood, remember that the aorist isn't just about past time, but it's also simple in aspect. And that's the key for translating aorist infinitives, participles, and imperatives. They're not different from the present tense in terms of time, but in aspect, how complete the action is, for example. So to illustrate this, let me give you a couple examples with a present and an aorist form in the infinitives and imperatives. So let's start with infinitives. You've already seen the expression dei, it is necessary, or someone must do something. I could have a very simple expression, dei humas epon erkestai. That's the present form of the infinitive that you see in red, which is very simply translated, it is necessary, dei, for you, humas, to go back epon erkestai. But what this really means, if I wanted to be very, very particular to the Greek, is that it means it is necessary for you to start going back. This is a continuous aspect in the present that really tends to come through with infinitives. So you can perfectly well translate it as it is necessary for you to go back or you must go back. But what it really would sound like to a Greek listener is that it's necessary for you to start going back, like starting right now over time. But if I want to say that someone needs to do something and get it done quickly or once, I'm going to use the aorist infinitive instead. And that's when I would use dei humas epon elthein. That's the second aorist infinitive from erchomai becomes elth. So this translation here, dei humas epon elthein, that's the blue form, the aorist infinitive, means it is necessary for you to go back. It translates roughly similarly, but the difference here is that it doesn't mean to start going back like the present implies, but to go back and to do it once, to get it finished. So I might instead, if I want to say, hey, you need to go back home and you need to get home quickly, I might use the aorist infinitive to get that completed idea across. Dei humas epon elthein. Get home right now and don't come back, right? I might give it a more completed aspect to it. That's how the aorist is used instead of the present. And this also comes across with imperatives. Why would I give a command in the aorist? Well, look at the difference between these two forms. I could, for example, say erkeste or erche sa or erchu dero. Come here. But what that really means in the present tense is kind of come here over time, like start coming over here, start walking towards me. You may not get there, but at least start the process, start fixing that car, start coming over here. When I use the aorist form, elthedero, which you've seen in your translations, means come here, do it now, and do it once. Don't just start coming over here, finish the action. Elthedero, come here. So when we give that command in English, we're often using more of an aorist kind of aspect to it. If I tell someone, hey, come over here, I want them to come here right now, and I want them to do it once. So in Greek, I would cover that with the aorist imperative, elthe, rather than the present, erkeste, which you almost never see for a verb like to go. Rather, the Greeks would prefer to put it in the aorist because it means to do it and do it once. When it comes to participles, there's an important principle that you'll want to remember, and this can be a little tricky to get across, but there's an easy way to translate aorist participles. First, the technical bit. Aorist participles can sometimes differ from participles in time, but more importantly, they're different in aspect, how complete they are. Think about what we saw with the infinitives and the imperatives on the previous slide. But like the infinitives and participles, they represent simple actions that were finished, and this is the key part of this definition, before the main verb of the sentence. That sounds confusing. Let's look at a couple examples of a present and aorist participle in the same sentence. So, one thing that I want you to remember, the easiest way to handle aorist participles is to translate them with one of two phrases. Having blanked, having done something, or after doing something. Those are the two stock ways you can almost always translate an aorist participle in a relatively smooth way in a sentence. What this means is that if you look at these two Greek sentences, let's start with the present participle. Epanerchomenoi epausamen. That's an aorist form of to stop. The way I translate that is either while going back or just simply going back, we stopped. The present participle means that it's happening at the same time as or contemporary with the main verb. When did we stop? We stopped while we were going back, in the middle of going back. So maybe if I were traveling back from Sparta to Athens, we stopped somewhere in the middle of that. While going back, we stopped. That's the force of the present participle. It's the same time as the main verb. However, if I use the aorist participle, that tells me that the participle action happens before the main verb. Look at how that changes the meaning of this sentence very importantly. Epanelthontes epausamen means having gone or after going back, we stopped. So think about that example before. If I say while going back we stopped, that means it's stopping in the middle of the journey. Maybe we didn't quite get back home. But if I use the aorist form, epanelthontes, that means we stopped after we got back. We already made it, for example, home or to Athens or back somewhere else. Epanelthontes has a very different meaning, very important difference from the present participle, epanerchomenoi. So once you get more comfortable with these aorist participles, you'll eventually find some smoother ways to translate these, like going back, for example. But generally, the thing I want you to remember, the easiest way to handle an aorist participle, and I typically do this in my own translating to just get the sense of the Greek, is to use either the phrase having done something, like having gone or having walked, or after blanking, after going back, after walking back, something like that. One of those two ways is always a perfectly acceptable and perfectly accurate way to translate an aorist participle to make sure that it happens before your main verb. So that's your key thing to remember for aorist participles. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, how the heck do I know if a verb is a second aorist or a first aorist? Is there something I need to know linguistically? Is there some way I can predict it from the form? The simple answer to that is nope, not at all. Very simply, you have to look at the principal parts of the verbs. This is where those 10 pages in Pratt, 108 to 18, and your principal parts list in Athenaze, towards the back of the textbook, are very important. So just as a quick review, anytime you look at a Greek dictionary of any size, they're going to list 6 principal parts for all of your verbs, which will give you all of the information you need to give any tense, any voice, any combination that you need. And they go in the order that you see in the bullet point right below. The first principal part is always the present. The second is future. The third is the aorist form. And after that, you get the perfect middle passive, and then the aorist passive at the end. Those are the 6 in order. Those 6 forms can tell you how to form all the different tenses and voices in Greek. So as we move through some of the different forms this semester, you'll start to notice that Athenaze will start giving you principal parts as you learn different verbs. They won't just give you the present form like luo or lepo, but they'll tell you what those look like in the future and aorist. And that's important because sometimes you can't predict what happens when a verb goes to the future and the aorist. Think of pharaoh, for example, which goes to oiso in the future and enenkon in the aorist. There's absolutely no way for you to know that or predict it except by memorizing the principal parts. But a word of caution in all this. A lot of verbs, in fact most verbs, will break some of the rules at some point, which is why principal parts are often used as reference. We can't always remember or predict the way different forms form different tenses and voices. And so even people who have been taking Greek for several decades or years will often go back to principal parts to look up what happens when one verb goes to a different tense. It's common for all of us, and it's a very handy reference because otherwise we'd go crazy trying to remember all the different ways that Greek verbs break rules. So don't think of this as something you have to have completely down right away. You do want to start memorizing them, and we will be pushing this in class, but you also want to think of the principal parts list as a very handy reference to help you from going too insane when trying to learn all these different forms. Always go back to these pages to look up a form that you've seen, in case you can find it. And as we go through the semester, keep in mind that the ones that are particularly irregular, like say pharaoh when it becomes enenkon, I'll make sure to draw attention to those, as does Athenaze. So don't despair. These are not things you have to chart on your own, but you can benefit from the experience of people who have gone through and suffered through all these Greek verbs before you, so don't let this intimidate you. So how does looking at a principal parts list help you with this? Well, let's take luo. These are the principal parts of luo that you'd find in any standard Greek dictionary, and just for reference, I've included up above the forms of luo what the different principal parts represent. So for instance, the first principal part of luo is luo. That's the present indicative form. And from luo, as you've already seen, I can form the present tense in the active and middle passive voices. I can say luo or luomai. I just start with the stem. The future form luso tells me how to form the future active or middle passive. In this case, it's pretty simple. I just add a sigma. The third principal part of luo is elusa. And just by looking at that form, because it has sigma and alpha at the end, that's very typical first aorist. So that's not going to form the same way as we've seen with lepo or gignomai or the other verbs that you go through this chapter that have a second aorist. This one doesn't apply. Elusa is a first aorist. We're going to learn about this in chapter 12 and 13 a little bit later. And that's how I can tell. There's no other way for me to predict this except to double check the principal parts for the verbs as you're going through. So it's important that you start memorizing the more important ones from these chapters. On the other hand, if I look at lepo's principal parts, I'll see that it goes from lepo in the present to lepso in the future, and oh goodness, it becomes elepon in the aorist. I've changed my stem from lep to lip. I see the familiar ending on. That's a telltale sign of the second aorist. And once I know that, I can go through all the endings you've seen before. Elepon, elepes, elepe, elepomen, elepete, elepon. Easy as that. You always can go to the third principal part, the aorist, to tell whether it's first or second aorist, and plan accordingly. So that's how the principal parts are very, very helpful as you go through different verbs. Make sure that you become very comfortable and familiar with these different stems. Okay, so a couple more things from this chapter that are going to be important. A very important impersonal verb is doke, which you'll learn in this chapter. Its future form is dokse, just adding a sigma, and its aorist form is edoksen. This is always in the third person singular form, and it means it seems, or really it seems good to someone. And that someone will always be in the dative. So for example, doke moi means it seems to me, or really it seems good to me to do blank. And I'll see an infinitive come after that. Another way I could translate that is I think it best. If it seems good to me, that means I think it's good. That's a way I can translate it into a smoother English sentence. Or sometimes I decide to do something. Which is why, if you study Greek epigraphy, for example, if you read ancient Greek inscriptions that record laws, you'll often see the very important phrase, edokse boule. It seemed good to the council, which really means the council decided on something. The boule could be like a senate or an assembly or something like that. But edokse boule doesn't just mean, oh, the council thought it was a good idea, but really that the council took measures to vote on it and decided on that. That's a formal action in Greek inscriptions. And you're often going to see an infinitive come afterwards. It could say, for example, it seems good to me to attack the Spartans tonight. That's probably not a good idea to ever attack Spartans at night, but let's say I thought that was a good idea. I'd say doke moi, it seems good to me to do that. So that's how doke works. Another important verb is pasco, which you've seen before. When it goes to the future, it has the irregular pace, somai, its deponent in the future. Its aorist is second aorist. It is epathon. Notice the stem has changed from pask to path. This is actually our very common root. It's our root for a word like pathetic. If something is pathetic, it creates a lot of emotion and experience and suffering, which is why it's related to the Greek verb for to suffer or experience. Epathon is the aorist. I suffered or I experienced. Another important word that will have one of the longest entries in any Greek dictionary is ho logos to logu, which at its basic meaning means a word, but can also come to mean A story in a myth is a logos, or sometimes something more formal like an argument, which is also why logos can also sometimes mean reason, which is why it's also our root word for logic in English. So logos, typically you can translate as word or story or account, sometimes argument, but word is almost always a good way to get it across in a normal Greek sentence. You'll learn another preposition in this chapter, para, which takes the accusative, typically for a person only, which means to someone. So if I send a letter to my friend, I will use para and put my friend in the accusative, to so-and-so. Another important combination of phrases. The word echo, you already know means to have, but it takes a different meaning when it comes with an adverb. This is an idiomatic combination in English, or rather in Greek, sorry, that means to be. So for example, echo kalos doesn't mean I hold beautifully, which it looks like, but really means I am well. It's almost kind of similar to when I ask someone, how are you holding up? It's not exactly the same phrase, but that might help you remember how echo plus an adverb means to be. So I could ask in ancient Greek, poseches, how are you? Not necessarily how are you holding, but how are you, like how are you doing? Poseches, I could answer with ekokalos, I am well, or uk ekokalos, I am not well at all. Finally, last slide here, a couple more important vocabulary notes. You'll notice that a couple of the verbs that you're learning have very different stems in different tenses. Haireo has a future haireso, looks a lot like the present, but in the aorist has a totally different root, heilon, I lifted. Why this odd aorist? Well, haireo goes through a process that we call suppletion, which is fairly common among Greek verbs, where two different verb stems entirely get combined into one set of principal parts. This is kind of like when we have go and went in English. That's another verb that went through suppletion, where it kind of suppletes or combines two different forms of the verb. There's no way to predict haireo becomes hail in terms of the etymology or linguistics. This is just something you have to memorize with haireo. The root here is hel, which gets an augment, which is why you get heilon at the beginning. Another strange aorist is lego. Lego is a very old Greek word that goes through lots of changes. Lego has two futures, either lexo or ero, I will say. You'll see both forms in your textbook. The aorist also can have two forms, either elexa, which is the first aorist form, or apon, to say or to speak, I said, apon. This is another suppletion that's happening both in the future tense and the aorist tense. What you're looking at in the aorist with apon is actually the result of a very, very old Greek word, and something that I'll talk about a little bit when we look at some of these weird forms a little bit later. The original root of apon comes from the word wep, which starts with a very old Greek letter that drops out by the time you get to the Attic texts that you're reading later next year. Like, for example, wep, digamma, which makes a W sound, looks like a lowercase f that drops below the line. You can see the spelling in blue there. Wep is a very old Greek word root that means to speak or to say, that gets combined with lego, through suppletion over time. So the remnants of wep, which you can hear in apon, get combined through suppletion and survive in a different form. So that's why you have two different aorists of lego. And finally, we already should be familiar with this by now, but just as a bit of review, pros can take two cases, as you've seen before, and this will be important to know by now. When it takes the dative, means at, near, or by, and with the accusative, to or towards, or sometimes against, implying motion. Have those stuff down and you'll be all set. So we'll spend some good time on the aorist. This should be one of the last few things we get this semester, but make sure that you go through this chapter carefully and please take the time to rewatch or re-listen to this lecture as you do so. I'll see you guys tomorrow.